you all with us today on what we think will be a very exciting, not just set of presentations, but interactions with some great speakers. But before we introduce those speakers, a couple of things about logistics. Number one, we are recording this so that if that bothers anybody, you'll need to, so to speak, exit stage right. We hope it doesn't. Number two, logistics. We would ask all of you to turn your mute on as mics off so that we can minimize, if not eradicate, the background noise. When it comes time for questions and answers, and we certainly do want the interaction, we'll offer you two opportunities. Number one, obviously the chat room, and you can put your question in the chat and we will be watching that and making sure that those questions are taken up as time permits. But number two, if you would like to directly ask a question to the speaker, we'd ask you to do the following. One, obviously take yourself off of mute. Two, please introduce yourself so that the conversation can be a little bit more personal and we get to know each other a little bit more. And when you ask your question, please try to be on point, succinct, and brief so that we can get as many questions and answers as possible in the time allocated. So with that, let us get started. And I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Meredith Wills. Meredith has been doing some really groundbreaking research for a number of years in baseball. I would joke with her for a moment that she received a higher calling to do baseball research after having done a number of years of space science research supporting the NASA space program. But Meredith has a PhD from Harvard. And if you're part of the SABR analytics community, Meredith truly needs no introduction. And I believe she will be speaking again on this topic next month. And so with no further ado, you can see the much better title for her presentation than the early stage one that I sent out. So Meredith, we thank you so much for spending some time with us on, at least in Cleveland, cold, snowy Saturday afternoon. So over to you, the baseball mic.
Thanks, Joe. And I think my dad would agree with you about it being a higher calling, actually. So for those of you who want to sort of look into bits that I don't go into here, Stephanie Apstein published an article in Sports Illustrated that actually came out on the 9th. And it's about my study of this, but it's sort of a journalist version, and it's a lot of fun. So anyway, 2020 baseball, because you always have to study a new one. So a little bit of recent history. Suppose this is change number 4 in the last few years. The first one, which actually extended from the middle of 2015 through the end of 2018, was the first time that we associated a noticeable decrease in drag. And there was a home run commission that was put together that to specifically look at the 2017 home run surge. And they did find that the home run surge itself was due to ball, which at the time we weren't aware of whether or not, like basically what the source of the surge was. They knew the ball was different. They couldn't find what the difference was. I did find a difference, which was that actually, can you guys see my mouse? Can you see my mouse?
Yes, there's
awesome.
Your mouse.
Okay, that's great. I've got a pointer. That the laces on the 2017, or all in that period, were slightly thicker, about 9% thicker, which turns out to have been enough to, it looks like, keep the balls physically rounder, just because the laces won't stretch as much. And so that appears to be sort of the primary reason that we've ended up with balls with less drag when the laces have been thicker. 2019, the ball changed again, and very dramatically, with in that case the leather was smoother, seams were lower, ball was rounder. The leather being smoother didn't have an effect, but the lower seams seem to have been mostly what did it. And again, the 2019 home run committee did in fact find that seam height has an effect on drag. So after the 2015 to 2018 ball, the 2019 had even lower drag. And then we went to the 2019 postseason, where it turns out that the balls basically died And the reason that happened was because they combined, there was a mix of balls that were from the 2019 regular season and balls that were from a completely different season. And so they used those two together as a mix, and the balls from the other season were much, had had higher drag. And so what you had was you had a deader ball overall, but it was also a mix so that the day-to-day drag turned out to be very erratic. So basically it was kind of a, you don't know where it's going to go. So with that in mind, I think everybody was expecting that the 2020 would go back to normal. It's like, be nice if it went back to normal. So what, I have no idea. Can people see the plots on the side?
Yep.
Okay, good. So if you actually look at the 2020, at first blush, it looks like they've gotten better with it. They have, if you look, the size is sort of, it's a pretty widespread, but it's kind of in the range we'd expect. The weight, similarly, they're within spec. In particular, the seam heights have gone back up. And I guess to clarify what we're looking at in these plots on the side, this is, these different colors are different samples. Sorry, I can't get my mouse through some of this stuff. So, basically the red is 2019, and then this kind of goldenrod color is 2020. So those are, and blue is 2018. So those are kind of the ones that have the densest samples. But what you end up seeing is that, there's the size is a broader range that, covers all of spec. The weight is less than last time. The seam height in particular has gone back to normal, from the dip in 2019. And then the lace thickness, which was an aberration in 2019, has gone back to pre-2019 levels. So what we're looking at is a ball that looks a heck of a lot like the 2018s. And again, Rob Arthur even found that the drag was comparable, if not lower. So, so it looks like, and I've got this checklist that's going to go through. So as far as the 2020, yeah, looks like maybe we're getting back to the ball that everybody wants to be playing with, meaning not the 2019. Certainly the pitchers didn't like 2019. However, turns out that when you take the baseballs apart, because that's one of the things I do, this one was just very unusual, because what I had a sample of 43 baseballs, and of the 43, 28 of them had something that looked like basically everything going back to 2002. I mean, this is something called the center, is the technical term, believe it or not. And what you're looking at here, there are, the pill plus 4 layers. So you have the pill, which is the sort of center cork and rubber core. There are then 3 layers of yarn. So there's an inner layer of thick gray yarn, a middle layer of sort of medium white, and then an outer layer of thin gray yarn. Then there's also a very thin layer of basically cotton sewing thread. And so what I found was, again, 28 of the 43 looked the same as balls I had going back to 2002. 15 were very, very different on the inside. So the overall weight turned out, and by the way, the reason you use weight is because the balls are made, the centers in particular, using a winding machine that has an automatic weight trip for each layer. So once the ball gets to a certain weight with that layer, the machine automatically shuts itself off. It doesn't rely on a human being to track that. You get these very, very precise weights for each layer. 2.5 grams is huge. Frankly, it's not something that's just like uncertainty. It also was, you could make up with the inner layer being 3.5 grams lighter and the outer layer being 1 gram heavier. So, with between all of those, this was something that was clearly a different set of specs. This was nothing like we'd ever seen. It does meet all the requirements, but this was a very, very different ball on the inside. So again, we have we had 2 baseballs that I found in 2020 that met 2 different sets of specs, one of which I've never seen before. So, excuse me. So anyway, to get try to understand, were these actually 2020s? Because you have to understand, when I was first looking at this, I had balls from 2020 games, but I didn't necessarily know, did they all come from them, that sort of thing, or were they all manufactured for 2020? So what I did was I actually decided to look at the manufacturing dates, which required cracking their batch codes. It turns out I feel almost foolish about this, because once I realized what was going on, it's remarkably straightforward. Rawlings uses an inventory batch designation cipher, let's say, that uses the word black horse. And it's basically one, there's the graphic on the side is great. But so, one corresponds to B, 2 to L. And so they already use this on baseball gloves. And it's for inventory, so that you know when it's made, in that case, something about the sources. What I found was when I took those 7-letter batch codes, and there's an example in the picture or in the graphic, and I inserted the black horse cipher, I got an inventory designation that was 2-digit month, 2-digit year, and then a 3-digit, what I'm referring to as a production week. And it's because batches cover an entire week. And they're generally back-to-back weeks, but not always, but the numbers themselves are consecutive. So like you can have a 2-week gap, but consecutive 3-digit numbers. And they're literally consecutive. So like you'll have maybe, say 150 to 200 one year, and then it starts at 201 the next year and goes through 250 and that kind of thing, to the point where it's rolled over now. And I want to say we're in the 12th. No, we're higher than that, 1800s maybe. And it goes back to probably before 2000. So, but yeah, so what that meant was that I then had manufacturing weeks for that entire sample, which goes back to 2002. So knowing that, what I found was that the balls, all of the balls that I got from 2020 games were in fact made during the 2020 production cycle. And kudos to Sports Illustrated, in fact, ton of great graphics that they did for finding a nice way to display this. This is just the center weight, so it's just one example. Sorry. But you can see that there's, essentially the weight of the centers is consistent, and it does go all the way back. It's just at some point, the graph becomes overwhelming. And then you get to the 2020 production cycle, which actually started in June of 2019. And the first few months of it, they made what you would call balls with normal center specs. Then from September through the middle of January, so September 2019 through January 2020, they switched entirely to the new specs. And then in January of 2020, they switched back to the specs they'd used first. So there are these distinct time periods that are, there's clearly been a switch over within production that has extended over months. It's not like these were done side by side or something like that. There's batch codes are only referring to one production or the other. Another thing that's interesting is the new specs covered 4 months, and production is a year-round thing. There'll be 12 months associated with a given production cycle. So that's a third of production. And what you have to realize is that advance orders for teams end up amounting to 3/4 of production. So it works out, you'd have 1.2 million baseballs that Rawlings would prepare for the major leagues. You're going to pull 400,000 and have 800,000 left over. The problem is that those advanced orders are usually for 900,000. So, and the decision was made in January, which was before COVID. So they did not anticipate a COVID shortened season at the time. So it does make for an interesting thing that I still don't know. I'm continuing to try to understand, because you've got a situation where they would have had a mixed ball, basically. They would have had 2 baseballs because they just couldn't. It either would have been this new spec plus the normal at the very least, or it would have been the normal plus something else that they had in inventory. Like you couldn't have done it and filled all the orders. So there are a number of things in this that I still don't understand. And this is just sort of the start. But so yeah, so we've got for checklist, yeah, ball looks normal, but there are 2 of them, even though it looks normal. Both balls were made as part of the 2020 production cycle, and you would have expected to see both balls in games because, for a normal season, because you couldn't have avoided it. Again, assuming a non-COVID shortened season. So, knowing that we were likely to have seen, more to the point, I found there were 2 baseballs being used in games, and with specs that were that different, the idea that there was not going to be a difference in performance seemed very unlikely. My original thought was that, the ball being, not just the ball being smaller, but the way that the layers were changed, and it's since been corrected by MLB as to these changes. It looked like it might have also increased the coefficient of restitution because of the way that the yarn was removed from one layer and added to another. So I thought, okay, well, I'll look at home run distance distributions and see, are we seeing something that looks different than previous years? Because what you would expect is if you have 2 balls traveling 2 different distances, the home run distribution curve is not going to match previous years. Now, to describe these curves, what I'm looking at is these are all percentages of home runs over the course of a season. So the overall number doesn't matter. And it's just the percentage that travels at least a given distance. So at least 350, at least 400. I mean, they're finer than that. And what you can see is, and you'll see some others, but there were definitely park-to-park variations, and pretty significant in some cases. But in a lot of cases, you saw instances where the curves were very different. Because, I've got Minnesota here, and I'm going on some of this from memory because I've got the end of the graph cut off on mine. But the graph there is largely the same shape for 2015 through 2019. There's 2018 tends to kind of have a dip with everybody because the ball was had higher drag. But that kind of kink that you're seeing where there is not a matchup because you're coming in with too few balls, say around 375, too few home runs, and then more than you would expect at, say, 400. So that makes sense if you actually have 2 baseballs, one of which travels a longer distance than the other. And in fact, one of them that, because that proportion's gone up at 400, that the one that has more carry also very likely has lower drag than any previous season. So just to show what the park-to-park variations can look like, this is Minnesota, this is Atlanta. This is the most dramatic because, of course, you show your coolest example, but there are several like this. San Diego, Miami are the first ones that come to mind. There are a few others. That curve is scary different. And if you think about, Atlanta had a lot of very long home runs, but it looks like it wasn't just a few outliers, which is normally the ones that stick in your head are the ones that are like the most impressive. In this case, there were genuinely a lot more long home runs. So this looks like, I don't know, most, I don't want to say all because you don't know that, but an awful lot of the population here were these balls that had more carry. I have been, the idea that they would be the balls with the new specs makes sense for the reason that the ball is so different from anything before that, given the choice, it makes more sense that your new specs would behave differently than the ones that are almost the same as everything going back through 2015. Well, further than that, but we only have StatCast data back through 2015. So just to show, though, that it's not everybody had, these new spec balls. If you look at the Dodgers, and again, there are a few like this. I want to say the Cubs are like this as well. Tampa Bay to some extent. And so here what you have is something where it's the opposite, where it looks like they probably had mostly very close to all normal baseballs, because again, the curve is very similar. The little kink, which I don't think was all normal, but pretty close. Although this also suggests, and this fits with Rob Arthur's findings, that that normal ball may have actually had higher drag. So therefore, you would expect the percentages to go down more quickly when you're going to longer home runs. So the main thing here, regardless of which ball is doing which, is that there's definitely park to park variation where that makes the most sense as a mix, and that one of those balls actually carried a very different distance, much further. Now, I should throw out the one caveat. I can think of another reason. This was the first year that we had Hawkeye. It is possible that every single park was badly calibrated differently. I am not going to throw that out because it is new technology, and that is not outside the realm of possibility. So that might be something people want to look at just in case, or at least we might know for this season. If for some reason we're still getting all these wonky things that look identical to the wonkiness of this year, or I should say this past season. So what was interesting is, having found these changes that were clearly new specs, when we approached MLB to sort of say, yeah, we're trying to understand what happened. If anybody else has ever written about this kind of thing or any kind of thing where you approach MLB for comment, usually you don't get this level of openness. It was really pretty impressive. They basically said, yeah, we put an experimental change on the baseball, absolutely. And it covered the period of time that you're talking about. Exactly. It's basically the ball that you found is our experimental ball. They referred to the balls with the new specs as test balls. And they also said that those new spec balls, they had determined they were going to withhold them from use in 2020 games, and they would only be used for spring, I assume 2020 spring training, but also probably 2021. So you get an overlap there. And practice balls, which, by the way, practice being stamped practice, so that it's very clear if they're practice balls or not. And they also specified that the new specs were intended to deaden the ball by decreasing COR and hence leading to lower exit velocities. This is where the assumption that I'd made about possibly having higher COR falls down, because it turns out that the way they did it was to decrease the tension on the winding of the innermost layer, which by it being looser makes it less dense. It's going to be more compressible. Yeah, it'd be very hard to not have a lower COR under those circumstances. So, you have a lower COR ball. I perfectly fine with that. And it was nice to have the information there. The thing is that the real world observations, again, it's mostly that these raise questions because I don't have the answers. The fact that the test balls were a third of full production, and again, enough where they would have ended up in games, it seems odd that those are being referred to as test balls. I don't know if they were considered that all along, if it wasn't in retrospect, but it's a strange thing, largely because, again, you would have needed both of those balls in games. And frankly, I have data showing that there were both balls used in games, and that home run distribution data also backs that up. We also know from the home run data that one of those balls flew further. That's not to say that the exit velocity wasn't down. In fact, it's not out of the realm of possibility that you could have a ball that has a lower exit velocity, but still has less drag, because they are two different types of changes. So it's quite possible that we'll see, what I'm thinking of as an undead ball, in that it comes off the bat slower, but maybe does travel farther. So again, a lot of things to keep track of, which is why I'm doing this list. So the ball, let's see, yeah, changes, park to park variation, balls with different carry. So the thing is, though, this is the checklist. The takeaways are sort of as more important to keep in mind, because the fact that the balls looked and felt the same means that, and talking to players is fascinating, means that they had two different baseballs that performed differently, that, when you held them, when you threw them, they were indistinguishable. A player could not tell these apart. I can't tell these apart without taking off the covers. And I know there are two balls. The players did not. It's never been done before to have two baseballs that are legitimately part of production for a given season. And again, the idea that the normal season would have been difficult without having two balls. And I still don't know the answer for that. I don't know, makes it sound like the whole point was two balls. I'd love someone to explain that. The fact that, again, the deadened ball might actually travel farther, partly because those changes are so dramatic. And I'm not sure we know what's going to happen. Particular the things as far as like the way the ball is going to carry, it's not something that's as easy to test in a lab. You actually need things like the aggregate change, the aggregate, say, decrease in drag from something like the StatCast data. And so I was able to find it, but I'm not sure that they were looking. And anyway, it wouldn't have been till after the fact. It was after these balls were made, and finding that change in carry, we may not know till this coming season. The other one that is interesting is that this really is a first. We've never had an instance where there has been a change made to the ball that was not announced beforehand, and after the fact, somebody discovered it had happened, but nobody had been told. This is not something that we have evidence for. There's certainly no evidence, at least in my data set, and I'm not going to go back further, that there's ever been a dramatic spec change like this, and certainly not the short period of time. I don't know, maybe the rabbit ball in '87. Oh, look. So it really is sort of a historic thing, in its way, because, oh, look, if you want to take the words of MLB secretly changed the ball, I don't know. I mean, I suppose there's better ways to put it, but so MLB and people, I think, are more aware of this than this actual study, which is that after MLB gave their comments to Stephanie Epstein, 2 days later, they sent a memo, an internal memo to GMs, AGMs, and equipment managers with with basically the statement they'd given us verbatim. I remember someone mentioning it to me, and I'm like, oh no, I've already read that. That memo was then leaked, and so the public and players and stuff are aware of the changes, even though there was no public announcement on the part of MLB. So people know that the ball is expected to be different, but it's just the way it's been put out. It is what it is. So we know we should be expecting these in 2021 with these new specs. The StatCast data is going to be useful because that will allow us to confirm if the new specs turn out to be the ball with more carry. And if not, I don't know what to tell you, other than that the data in 2020 looked like there's a ball with more carry. It'll also be interesting because it should enable a validation of the performance projection model. I've been chatting a bit with Alan Nathan about that. He was kind enough to put out the equation that he used, which absolutely the decrease in COR would have led to a substantial decrease in distance traveled, even with everything else taken into account. What seems to be the case, though, is that that particular performance projection model, I think, is based on baseballs that fit into the previous types of specs. And based on other things, like, for instance, the KBO ball had changed between 2018 and 2019, announced in advance. And it doesn't match those. Alan mentioned about doing, you basically needing to look at those data to come up with a slightly different performance projection model. So it's going to be interesting to see if this very noticeable change in specs fits with the projection model that he used, or if there might be a way to modify it so that it's more universal, such that you can have dramatic changes, and then it's still meaningful. So on the other hand, if the ball ends up acting exactly like they say it does, that says that the existing one is great. But we're gonna learn a lot on that, and I think it's going to help moving forward. Meanwhile, people keep asking me about, so what's the 2021 ball going to look like? But between MLB's informing people that the ball has been deadened and my data showing a ball with more carry, all I can say is I have no idea. I really don't know where the ball is going next year. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And we probably have 15 seconds for questions.
We got a little bit more than that, Meredith. This is Joe. We've got some questions in the chat box. If I
Great.
can throw them your direction. Number one,
Please.
how did progressive field look? You showed a couple of fields and distributions of balls. How do you remember how?
I actually, if you're willing to bear with me, I've literally got it like on my phone. This is where I have a lot of them. I want to say progressive field. Now, and there are, I should point out a few that are not in here because let's see, progressive had it looks like a mix. It's very similar to the Minnesota graph.
Okay.
Mhm.
And second question, have you had any communications from Rawlings on your research and findings? Any direct interaction with them?
Personally, no. We did approach Stephanie Epstein did approach them for comment, and they actually, it was not an extensive statement, but what they said was that they did the standard large scale tests, and that within those large scale tests they weren't finding the changes that we had looked at, but they also didn't clarify that the large scale tests were only one ball or only the other. And so if you were doing them for the entire 2020 population, you actually probably wouldn't see a change that could be defined as such.
Okay.
Coming up with home run distance distribution was one of the few ways I could find to isolate that there were actually two baseballs.
Okay, one last chat question, and we'll open up the mics. Have you looked at balls from different eras, say the 60s or the 70s, etc.?
Not yet, but damn do I want to. So if anyone wants to help, it's kind of hard to track those down. But seriously, if you've got baseballs lying around, I would love to see balls from I'm currently working on a study that's going to go back into the 80s, but that's because you can actually find enough baseballs going back that far to like do a meaningful study. Otherwise, I'm only going to get maybe one-offs if I can track them down. But if anyone's got old baseballs that they're willing to give up, because these will donate their bodies to science.
Anybody want to ask Meredith a question directly? Well, let me just offer to the group. Meredith briefly acknowledged, and you've seen in the charts, the Sports Illustrated article. If you haven't read it, it is a fascinating read, and Meredith goes a little bit deeper in the article to. It's not as easy as it might seem to get ball samples.
Yeah, Steph did a
analysis.
really good job on the investigative reporting. I was really, I felt like that made the science itself powerful by giving context, because it's it had, I mean, all along it's been interesting, and this one in particular, it's almost like this was maybe not an end, but this was how the previous studies had led up to how I have had to deal with, say, sources for baseballs or how things get reported or things like that. So, yeah.
Anybody want to ask a question to Meredith?
Yep, it's Mike McReynolds. How did you get interested in this type of research?
Oh man, it's a long
Oh
time.
wow.
That's all right. It's all right. So actually, it's kind of a circuitous thing. I was originally taking apart baseballs for collaboration with the Baseball Hall of Fame. I'm also a knitting designer, which turns out the skill sets actually turned out to be very useful for the research, because knowing, say, how wool or cotton behave it's an important knowledge base. But so I was using the yarn from inside the baseballs, because it turns out you can knit with it, to make pieces for auction off in support of the Hall of Fame, because it is a 501c3. And sort of already being familiar with taking apart baseballs, and then the 2017 home run surge happened, and actually Alan Nathan gave a great talk at SABR seminar in 2017, having to do with what the drag looked like year to year. And so that then the idea that the ball itself might be responsible, that was sort of when that idea first came out. And so, yeah, I thought, might as well look and see what the differences are. And I ended up finding that lace thickness thing almost as a last minute, but it worked. And so it's kind of gone from there. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Any other questions before we let Meredith go after a very interesting talk and presentation? All right. Well, Meredith, thank you so much. We will see you again next month at the Virtual Analytics Conference, correct?
Yep, and I'll do the shout out, which is you know, I'm always looking for baseballs. I'm serious. Like, and even stuff going back, anything you've got lying around. Now that I can date them, it almost doesn't matter when you got them. I'll be able to find it. So,
Yeah.
All right.
Good.
Thank
Well,
you.
Meredith, again, thank you so much for spending some of your Saturday with us here at the Jack Graney chapter. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, so thank you. So let us move on now to our second speaker. Mr. Gary Belleville, a person I've got to know recently. He comes all the way to us today from British Victoria, Columbia, or Canadian Victoria, Columbia. And he's done some really insightful research that got some play in the SABR website a couple of months ago about the long lost first no-hitter in the history of the Cleveland Indians. And in getting to know Gary a little bit more, I found out he's an IT professional, retired. So whenever we have a Zoom problem, we know where to go. So Gary, I'd like to again turn the baseball microphone over to you, and thank you so much likewise for spending some of your Saturday with us in the Jack Graney chapter winter meeting.
Hi, thanks, Joe.
Great.
And can everyone see my screen?
Yep.
Excellent. So last summer, I was writing a research paper for the Baseball Research Journal on no-hitters. And I was doing some data analysis, so I downloaded a bunch of data from RetroSheet and a number of other sites. And I was analyzing no-hitters between 1901 and 2019. And before I started to do my data analysis, I did a quick data completeness check to make sure I had them all. I was expecting 260 no-hitters. Lo and behold, I had 261. And it was pretty easy to figure out which was the extra one. It was the first one, a Pete Dowling no-hitter on June 30th, 1901. Not only did I not know who Pete Dowling was, I had never heard of a Pete Dowling no-hitter. So that started me on a quest to try and figure out, okay, how in the world does a no-hitter go missing? And how does it suddenly reappear 119 years later? So I'd like to share with you the results of some of my research. A bit on Pete Dowling first. He made his National League debut in 1897 and was a very solid left-handed pitcher. In 1899, had a very good season, but things derailed late in the season due to his taste for alcohol. And I won't go into the details, but if you're interested, his SABR bio mentions some of the things that went on in the 1899 season and the off season. And he found himself outside of Major League Baseball, or outside of the major leagues. But Connie Mack took a chance on him. He briefly had pitched for the Brewers, I believe it was 1897, and Mack was rewarded. Dowling had a good year. He actually threw a no-hitter in 1900 against the Cleveland Lakeshores in Milwaukee. And the Brewers had an excellent season. They finished in second place, finished 4 games behind the White Stockings. Now, in 1901, of course, the American League becomes a major league, and Dowling's back in the big leagues. And there are ongoing player raids and counter raids, and it's a very different scenario for Dowling in 1901. The opening day rosters in the American League have about 60% National League veterans on them. So his roster spot is a little less assured in 1901. He's got to face better hitters. Connie Mack leaves to join or become part owner of the Philadelphia Athletics and manages them for 50 years. And the new Milwaukee manager is Hugh Duffy. And then he's also got to contend with reduced roster sizes because of the raids and counter raids. Salaries go up. And so the American League has a 15-man roster limit in 1901. Now, Milwaukee's carrying 16 players. And unfortunately, Dowling gets off to a slow start in the 1901 season. He pitched a couple of good games against Cleveland, but his ERA is 5.62 at the June 1st deadline. And Hugh Duffy decides Dowling's the guy that has to go, and they sell his contract to Cleveland on June 1st. Now, the first time Pete Dowling faces his old team, June 30th, 1901, in Milwaukee at the Lloyd Street grounds. And the standings that day show Milwaukee and Cleveland at the bottom of the standings. When Dowling was sold to Cleveland, Milwaukee was in 7th place with a 4-game lead over Cleveland, but they've continued to have a really bad season in the month of June, and Cleveland's caught up to them. It's worth noting that there were rumors this season that both Milwaukee and Cleveland would be moved. Ben Johnson was really interested in getting into larger markets like St. Louis and New York. And neither team were particularly successful in attracting National League talent. They each signed 3 players who were potentially impact players, but they didn't get anyone of the stature of a Cy Young or Nap Lajoie. Now, a bit of context, the June 30th game happens in the middle of the 1901 Eastern heat wave, which is the deadliest heat wave in US history. 9,500 people die. And it wasn't deadly so much for the extreme heat, but it was sustained heat for a 6-week period from mid-June to the end of July. And it was centered on heavily populated areas. And on the right is the headline from the July 1st Milwaukee Journal. And the high on this particular day, the June 30th game, is 94 degrees. Now the game starts and Dowling is pitching extremely well. His fastball's got more zip than it has all season long. He's obviously well motivated to get revenge on his old team. And he's still a popular figure in Milwaukee. People remember what he did for the team in 1900 in that exciting pennant race. And he gets a warm reception every time he steps in or out of the pitching box. And once the no-hitter gets into the middle innings, he's got the entire crowd behind him. Now, bottom of the 7th rolls around. Cleveland's up 4-0. Dowling still has his no-hitter going. And the wire service report tells us that Milwaukee registers a hit on a hot drive by their shortstop, Whit Conroy, to Bill Bradley at third base, who could not handle it in time to put the runner out. So not a clean hit. It sounds like Bradley maybe could have retired him, but did not. And Bradley was one of the quality players that jumped from the National League. He was a very good fielding third baseman who jumped his contract with the Chicago Orphans to come to Cleveland. Game progresses into the 9th. Irv Beck hits a 3-run shot over the right field fence in the Lloyd Street grounds, which is no easy feat. Dowling pitches hitless ball for the rest of the game. And the game ends with no Brewer having reached second base. He faced 4 over the minimum. And so the wire service reports go out, and a story similar to what's on the right appears in papers across the country. And I'll just read the first little bit. Dowling pitched a wonderful game against his old teammates today, letting them down with but 1 scratch. And the term scratch hit obviously isn't in use today, but it refers to a ball that either is not hit particularly hard or not fielded cleanly. And in this case, all the reports are unanimous that it was a fairly hard hit ball. So it was a ball that Conroy did not field cleanly at third base. Cleveland Plain Dealer reports it as a 1-hitter, and the headline is 1 scratch single. Again, not a clean hit. Now, the Plain Dealer report was written by a non-staff correspondent, so they didn't send one of their reporters on the road, which was not uncommon in that era. However, the Milwaukee Journal has a completely different report. Headline, Dowling gets even. Former Brewer does not allow Duffy's man a hit or a run. And they explain why. The article states, Conroy hit a hot one to Bradley, who let it get away from him. However, He had plenty of time to recover himself, but failed, and Cleveland's only error resulted. So fairly reasonable explanation. And the box score that accompanies the story shows an error for Bradley, no hit for Whit Conroy. So what happened? The most plausible explanation is that the official scorer made a change after the game. Now, the official scorer, as was custom in the day, was probably a Milwaukee sports writer. The home team usually supplied the official scorer, and it was one of the one of the local sports writers. Now, if this, in fact, was the case, this is exactly what happened 16 years later in Ernie Koob's one-hitter / no-hitter that he threw. He was a Browns pitcher who threw a one-hitter in St. Louis. The game ended with it being a one-hitter. However, after a bunch of deliberations, the St. Louis sports writer, who was the official scorer, changed the hit to an error. And the St. Louis papers reported as a no-hitter. Headline in the Chicago Tribune was, Koob threw a one-hitter. However, unlike the Dowling case, the discrepancy was corrected. Now, because it's a hot, steamy day, the press box isn't a comfortable environment. It's fairly safe to assume that reporters weren't lingering, and they had stories to file. However, I checked all of the newspapers in the week following, and I could find no evidence that a correction was printed. So the question is, was the scoring change communicated to the reporters who wrote the wire service report and the plain dealer report? Could have been the same person, may have been only one person. And if it was communicated, when was it? We don't really know. It's worth noting that no-hitters around the turn of the 20th century were very different animals than they were later in the 20th century, or they are today. They hadn't reached that lofty status. Now, here's an example of a Jimmy Callahan no-hitter in 1902. You can see the low-key coverage. The report states, excuse me, Callahan was in rare form in the first game today and accomplished the unusual feat of shutting out his opponents without the semblance of a hit. And then they move on. Other reports spend more time talking about an appearance by Cap Anson at the game and horses on the field in a pregame ceremony than they do talking about Callahan's pitching. So it just was nowhere near a big deal as it would become in later decades. So it's possible if the reporter from the plain dealer was notified that he didn't think it was worth mentioning, or maybe just forgot. We don't know. Now, Dowling's next two outings against the Brewers. A week later in Cleveland, he gets the win in a high-scoring game. No mention in either papers of his June 30th start. August 2nd, a game he pitches in Milwaukee has eerie similarities to his June 30th outing. Same score, 7-0 for the Blues. And the only hit is a ball hit to Bradley, which is termed a measly little grass cutter that was slowly handled by Bradley. Now, the game story in the plain dealer says that Dowling has duplicated his feat of a month ago, the one hitter. The Milwaukee Journal reminds readers that on June 30th, Dowling made his former teammates look like 20 cents by shutting them out with neither a hit nor a run. So we're over a month later, and people in Cleveland and Milwaukee have differing views of what happened. His final start against the Brewers on August 8th in Cleveland, he gets the win again, strikes out 11, setting a new American League record. And the Milwaukee Journal reminds readers that the first time he faced Milwaukee, he shut them out without either a hit or a run. So this is the third time the Milwaukee Journal mentions the no-hitter. So we've got this information silo in Milwaukee where people have a different view of events. Early in 1902, the Plain Dealer publishes a story on the top pitching performances in the American League, and they're quite proud of what Earl Moore and Pete Dowling did in the 1901 season. And they reiterate again, Dowling was credited with 2 one-hitters in their view. 1902 Reach Guide comes out, which is classified as the official American League guide, has lots of statistics on the 1901 season. And on page 98, they print this very interesting matrix that for the top pitchers in the league indicate how many one-hitters, two-hitters, etc. each pitcher has shown. They say Dowling threw 2 one-hitters, but they also say he threw 1 4-hitter and 2 5-hitters. And if you look at Retro Sheet or Baseball Reference today, you'll see Dowling never threw a 4-hitter. He threw 3 5-hitters. And so I was wondering, did they mess up the other pitchers on this page? And so I checked. And every number on this page circled in red is different from what you'll find today on Retro Sheet or Baseball Reference. So the Reach Guide is not very reliable when it comes to their statistics. And then I thought, well, maybe they just weren't good at tracking pitcher statistics. I looked at batting stats. And here's the top 10 in the American League batting. Again, a sea of red. Everything circled in red is different from what we find today. In fact, some of these batting averages are off by as much as 9 percentage points. So early record keeping in the American League or even the National League was not very good. Now, we've got a situation where there's this information silo in Milwaukee. Now, you think that would eventually be broken down. But there are a number of impediments that are going to prevent the record from being corrected. The first is technology. So in 1901, the only mass communication tools are newspapers and magazines. And people in Milwaukee are reading one thing. People in Cleveland and the rest of the country are reading something else. So not only is there no TV or internet, there isn't even radio. The first Milwaukee radio station is 21 years in the future. There are no newsreels. We're in the early days of the silent movie era. Next, a few months after the season ends, the Brewers move to St. Louis and become the Browns. And Milwaukee spends the next 51 years, aside from their one season of the Milwaukee Bears in the Negro Leagues, they're a minor league city. So their sports writers are covering minor league baseball. Next, 1901 is Dowling's last season in the big leagues. He spends the last 4 years of his career out on the West Coast. In 1902, he might as well have been on the other side of the planet. And so he kind of falls off the media radar. And tragically, he dies 4 years after his no-hitter in this bizarre train accident. And the Milwaukee Journal mentions his death, but it's a one-line mention, and there's no details on what he accomplished in his career. So there's no reason for anyone to write a story about Pete Dowling and what he may have accomplished in 1901. And finally, the Lloyd Street grounds are torn down in 1904. This is important because whenever there's a no-hitter, the game story typically will mention the last time a no-hitter was thrown in that ballpark, or maybe they'll print a list of previous no-hitters thrown in that ballpark. Well, the Lloyd Street grounds is gone as of 1904. There was a no-hitter thrown at the Lloyd Street grounds in 1902. Doc Adkins of the Milwaukee Creams, who only existed for 2 years, pitched one in August of 1902. And the game coverage in the Milwaukee Journal mentions Pete Dowling's no-hitter on June 30th, 1901. So this is at least the fourth mention of the no-hitter in the Milwaukee Journal. And this is 14 months after the fact. So people in Milwaukee still believe Dowling threw the no-hitter June 30th, 1901. But this is the last time we see a professional no-hitter thrown at the Lloyd Street grounds. The next major league no-hitter in Milwaukee, or for a Milwaukee pitcher, comes in 1954 when Jim Wilson tosses one for the Milwaukee Braves. And I checked their game coverage to see if there was a mention of Dowling's no-hitter. And they mention a no-hitter from 1900, and that's Pete Dowling's minor league no-hitter, but there's no mention of what he did in 1901. And it was kind of strange. They mentioned, or they reference a Henry Dowling. And Henry was, in fact, his correct first name that's on his birth certificate. But this is the only time I ever saw a reporter refer to him as Henry Dowling. Everyone called him Pete Dowling. So it's pretty clear by this time the no-hitter's been forgotten in Milwaukee. Let's jump ahead a few years to 1969 when the Macmillan Baseball Encyclopedia comes out. And the Big Mac was edited in the first edition by David Neft, who at the time was working for Information Concepts, Inc., a computer firm. And ICI spent 3 years researching and compiling data for the Macmillan Baseball Encyclopedia. And this is actually the first baseball compendium produced by computers. And one of the challenges in putting together the Big Mac is baseball's early records were in disarray. And Neft quickly realized that to deal with the mess from the late 19th century and the first 2 decades of the 20th century, that he basically had to, he and his team had to start from scratch. And as Alan Schwartz describes, play league secretary from day one, have ICI build a new statistical log for every one of thousands of players. So basically from the ground up, they're building a game log for every big league player. Then they're going to use computer software to sum up these game logs to get the yearly totals and the career numbers for each player. Now, if you do that, you're going to have the most accurate baseball record book that's ever been produced, which is what the first edition was. Here's the title page of the Big Mac, the first edition. And you can see that it's been done with the endorsement of the American and National League. They participated in the creation of this masterpiece. And it's labeled the complete and official record of Major League Baseball. Neft was very transparent. In Appendix A, you'll see a list of all of their sources for compiling the data that appears in the Big Mac. At the top, they list the official records from the American League and National League. And you'll note the start year for the official records of the American League, 1905. And that's because everything before was lost or whatever there was unusable. Another key source was a private collection of John Tattersall, who had scrapbooks that he had compiled with old box scores dating all the way back to the beginning of the National League in 1876. And then the big one, newspapers. So on subsequent pages, they list every newspaper they used. Neft had a team of over 20 people fanned out across America, going to libraries and digging through old newspapers so that they could build up these daily logs for each player. So in the first edition of the Big Mac, strangely, there's no exhaustive list of no-hitters, but no-hitters are buried in the biographical information associated with the pitcher who threw it. So if you happen to flip to page 1812 of the Big Mac, first edition, below the bio information for Pete Dowling, you'll see a line circled in green here. No-hit game versus Milwaukee of the American League, June 30th, 1901. But then the no-hitter disappears again. The second edition comes out in 74. David Neft leaves the scene and he's not involved in the final 9 editions of the Big Mac. Edition 2 does have a list of all no-hitters broken down by league, and that's early on in the second edition, but no Pete Dowling no-hitter. And none of the 9 final editions mention a Dowling no-hitter. And John Thorne wrote something in his blog that potentially gives us a clue as to what might have happened. Now, when the first edition came out, many people in baseball were upset because a lot of the numbers were different from the traditionally accepted numbers. And in the second and subsequent editions, many of the prominent player stats were fudged back to their traditional values. Now, if a no-hitter by Pete Dowling suddenly reappears 68 years later out of the blue, that's, I would think, a little embarrassing to the American League. So perhaps someone was pressed to remove it from the other editions. Let's jump ahead to the 80s. Retrosheet comes along, and they start computerizing box scores and play-by-play accounts in 1989. And they start in the 80s, and they move backwards through baseball history, gradually digging deeper and deeper into the history of the game. July 12th, 2020, they very quietly issue updates on the Retrosheet website, and they post play-by-play information dating back to the 1928 season and box scores from the early years of the 20th century, going back to the beginning of the 1901 season. And on their event page for June 30th, 1901, a rather big transformation happened. So on the left, you can see what the event page for June 30th, 1901 looks like prior to July 12th. And they just have line scores for the games that happened on that day in the American League. And they're partial line scores. They don't include a hit or an error column. So we just know Cleveland beat Milwaukee 7-0. However, their updates tell a different story. And you can see for the two games played, there are line scores included with a hit and an error column. Milwaukee shows 0 hits and Cleveland shows 1 error in that game. And if you click on the box score hyperlink, you go to a box score that shows no hit for Whit Conroy and an error for Bill Bradley. So I show this to you to hammer the point that Retrosheet wasn't changing their mind on what happened that day and on Dowling's no-hitter. In the past, they just had no opinion on whether or not Pete Dowling pitched a no-hitter that day. So a bit about Retrosheet's process. They used one similar to ICI's process. They looked at all available evidence, as many sources as they could get their hands on. And if there was a discrepancy, they looked at all the evidence and they made a judgment call. Now, they didn't use exactly the same source materials that ICI did, but they came to the same conclusion. Pete Dowling threw a no-hitter on January 30th, 1901. David Smith from Retrosheet was kind enough to share this with me during my research. And it's the ICI page, the original printout from the late 1960s for Pete Dowling. And this is for his stint with Cleveland. And it looks similar to a game log you might find on Baseball Reference today. And you can see for the June 30th outing, if you go all the way to the right, there's a column, a no-hit column. And there's a 1 in the column for the June 30th outing, indicating that he did throw a no-hitter. And if you look at the hit column, you'll see that it's blank. And ICI's convention was to, in their printouts, just use a blank instead of a 0. So some of the pages wouldn't be full of zeros. So to conclude, did Pete Dowling throw a no-hitter on June 30th, 1901? In my opinion, I'd say it's highly likely he did. Can I say that he threw a no-hitter with complete certainty? No, of course not. The official records have long since been lost for the American League, and their record keeping was horrible in the early years. We just can't say either way with 100% certainty. But it was recognized by the official record book of the American League between 1969 and 1974. That's the Baseball Encyclopedia. And today, Retrosheet and Baseball Reference do recognize it as a no-hitter. Now, I've heard that the Elias Sports Bureau will not be recognizing it as a no-hitter. When I heard that, I was not surprised. Elias moves slowly, and Major League Baseball moves slowly. As an example, in 1977, a college student pointed out to them that Hack Wilson had 191 RBIs in the 1930 season, not the 190 RBIs that everyone previously believed. It took Elias Sports Bureau 22 years before they made the change. So in 1999, they acknowledged the fact that yes, Hack Wilson did record 191 RBIs in 1930. So it's going to take a while, but I'm expecting that at some point in the future, hopefully not 22 years from now, that this will get recognized by Major League Baseball. I've also heard that the Cleveland Indians media guide is going to have some sort of notation this year, but it's not going to be fully recognized. I think they're going to use a term like near perfect no-hitter. But we shall see what will happen. This is an ongoing story, and I'm going to continue as time permits to do more research, and there will be additional evidence that comes forward. So baseball records aren't chiseled in stone, as we have seen from the Reach Guide versus what we believe today. Things change over time as new evidence comes to light. So at this point, I'll open it up to questions.
Well, thank you, Gary, very much. There are a couple of questions in the chat box. One very straightforward. Where is Pete Dowling buried?
I believe he's buried in Oregon, close to where he was run over by a train.
Okay. And the second question, a little bit more complicated. Could the continual references in the early 20th century Milwaukee newspapers be due to the newspaper, quote unquote, morgues or old clippings of articles?
I'm sorry, because of what?
The newspaper morgues or clippings of articles from old newspapers. I'm just trying to read it from our chat box colleague here. Could the continual references in the early 20th century Milwaukee newspapers be due to the newspaper morgues, parentheses, old clippings of articles?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Like, I think you're the person asking the question is referring to the 1902 reference. It was 14 months later.
Yeah.
I mean,
Josh, if you could come off mute and kind of weigh in if I butchered your question?
Yeah. Hi, this is Josh from Oregon, actually, although I didn't know the connection until the last answer. My dad was a newspaper reporter in New York from 1950 to 1990. In the early days in the 50s, so I assume it was similar, 50 years previous, there was, obviously well before the internet, newspapers would have morgues by subject. So they may have, meaning all the old clippings from issues before. Right. So if they printed an article in 1901 that perhaps was incorrect, let's just say, that they would repeat that error again 14 months later. But that's just one small aspect of it. But when we were talking early 20th century papers, I was just wondering that. Obviously, you had more research since then that showed a lot more to the question here.
Yeah, I mean, it's speculation. Part of the difficulty is we don't even know who wrote these articles. There are no bylines on these articles at the time, so it could have been a different reporter. It could have been someone going on memory. Maybe they were there and they saw the no-hitter. Maybe they were in the press box. Maybe it was someone completely different who was relying on an old clipping. We just don't know.
Thank you, Josh. Any other questions? We've got a couple of minutes left for Gary.
I have a question. Obviously, you talk about the.
Could you introduce yourself, please?
Certainly. My name is Vince. I am actually a member here at in the Jack Graney, and obviously, I know you talked about the Milwaukee Journal and the Plain Dealer. All of those newspaper, all those cities at that point were multiple paper towns, and I just wondered what kind of further research you did relating to any of the other papers in town, because I know that sometimes, when you read accounts of the same sporting event from multiple papers, it looks like they were at different sometimes.
Yes, absolutely. And you're right. There are multiple papers, or there were multiple papers in Milwaukee. There was the Sentinel. Unfortunately, because of COVID, the Milwaukee Library is closed. And the Sentinel reports from 1901 haven't been digitized. And so no members of the public are allowed into the room where the Sentinel archives are kept, and staff members aren't even allowed to go in there. So that's one of the things I'll be doing post-pandemic.
I'm afraid we're going to have to bring this to a close. I'm sorry, Vince, did you have?
That I may be able to be of some assistance in Cleveland, because we were talking about the old morgues. The old Cleveland Press morgue ended up at Cleveland State. They are currently closed at this point, but I believe there are other places where you can go and look at the press on microfilm.
Yeah, I mean, if you're interested and able, I would take you up on that offer if you could go and take a look at potentially other media reports.
Cool. Let's touch base after this.
Great.
Great. Well, Gary,
Thank
thank you so much for a very interesting, insightful, and thorough presentation. So thank you so much
My
for,
pleasure.
again, spending some time with us today. So let us move on to our last topic, a topic that's gotten just well beyond SABR, but national attention. And that is the Negro Leagues, the database, the recognition of the Negro Leagues as being integrated record-wise into Major League Baseball records, and the rightful recognition of our colleagues at Seamheads from doing the literally leading edge research that they have been doing and continue to be doing. And we are so pleased today to have Mr. Michael Lynch and Mr. Gary Ashwill to be with us today and to share at least a brief view of their story about not only where they've come from, but where they're going, given the big spotlight that is now shining on them and their work. So Mike and Gary, I'll turn the baseball microphone over to you. And I believe, Mike, you're our first part of the tag team duo speech presentation.
Thanks for having us. I really appreciate it, and I've really enjoyed the presentation so far. So here's a brief history of the website. Officially, it launched in October of 2007, and my initial goal was to promote my first book, Harry Frazee and Van Johnson, The Feud That Nearly Destroyed the American League, that was coming out early in 2008. But the site is actually older than that. I met Kevin Johnson on the, I don't know if anyone remembers the old baseballboards.com forum. And a bunch of us used to hang out there and just talk baseball. And one time we had an all-time draft, and I mean, it was just all kinds of, I was on there so much, my boss finally said, hey, enough is enough. So the goal at that time with Kevin was ballparks information, because Kevin is heavily into that. He still is. And so we started there, and then, I taught myself HTML, started launching, all kinds of different things. And I thought I was doing pretty good until I showed my boss, who I thought was a friend. He said, wow, that sucks. So, fast forward, we got to 2007. I discovered WordPress, launched Seamheads, and like I said, it was to promote my book, get some writing in, blog about baseball, and so I started inviting people. I've known Gary for almost 20 years. Started inviting people through the SABR list, and we started getting some nice contributions. Gabriel Schechter, who's a good friend, he's contributed. Peter Golenbach, Jack Perconti, former major leaguer. So at that point, it was just basically a blog. And then we added the ballparks database, which is, as far as I'm concerned, it's the best database on ballparks out there. Park factors, dimensions, foul territory, space, it has everything. Longitude, latitude, you name it. I added first and last events, much like what you can find at Retrosheet. And we just recently added no-hitters. So we have every no-hitter except for Pete Dowling. So I managed to add that. My goal in the future is to add cycles, but that's a much larger project, because some guys had 7 plate appearances, and I want to list every single plate appearance as it happened. We had a podcast, not only just a single podcast, but an entire network sponsored by Big League Chew. That went by the wayside after a while. And then I got really lucky and we got the Negro Leagues data. Gary's been working on for years. Larry Lester, Kevin, Scott Simkus, you name it. There's a bunch of great guys out there. Honestly, I don't know much about the Negro Leagues, just what I've learned from Gary and Kevin and their updates. They're the experts. But when I learned that they wanted to post that data on the website, I was thrilled. And it's been, I mean, ever since, it's been amazing. It's, we've won awards, we've been recognized, and this last achievement where Major League Baseball finally recognizes them as a major league is, it's one of the highest honors that I can imagine. I am absolutely thrilled. I'm sure Gary and Kevin are too. In fact, Gary, congratulations, recently got a Henry Chadwick Award. Well-deserved. So right now, as far as the future goes, we were partners with Baseball Gauge. I met, when that launched, I was amazed by it. So I reached out to Dan Hirsch, the founder, and we partnered up. He's a lot of the reason why you have the data that you have now, because I didn't know how to program that stuff. Dan put it on for us. He taught Kevin how to update it. So Kevin updates that, I update no-hitters. And Gary and Kevin work close together with Larry, and whenever there's an update, we can take care of it now, which is good. So we're constantly working on that. I know Gary is working on different years, in single games, fielding stats. I mean, it's a constant product. It's going to be this way for a while because we don't have all the data. We have probably what, 90%, I think. And you never know. Maybe there's a trunk in somebody's attic that has something that we can use someday. But it's that's basically the future, is constant updates, updating ballparks database every year, no hitters, like I said, cycles. We've gone away from blogging, not completely. People still do contribute. I haven't written anything in a while, but I would say right now it's mostly going to be the database updates. And, you know, we try to help friends. We promote stuff through widgets and book reviews and articles and whatnot. But yeah, that's basically the gist of it as far as Seamheads goes.
Well, so we transition over to Gary and he can start filling in some details, right, of the Negro Leagues database yesterday, today, and tomorrow. So Gary, welcome.
All right, thanks a lot, guys. Thanks, Mike, and thanks to Meredith and Gary for those great presentations too earlier. I guess I wanted to first talk about how the Seamheads database came to be. After that, I'll transition to just talking about the Negro Leagues in general and the state of records and the challenges that we face in compiling them. And I'll close with talking about MLB's recognition and what it means, what it doesn't mean, you know, and how we'll go forward from here. So I started working seriously on the Negro Leagues when I was a graduate student in English, and I probably was spending a little too much time going through the microfilm stacks and looking for the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier instead of doing the research I should have been doing at the time. I continued doing this after graduate school, and I was eventually invited by Dick Clark and Larry Lester to contribute to the Negro League Researchers and Authors Group, which was the organization that was doing the research for what's usually known as the Hall of Fame study. It was funded by grant from MLB, administered by the Hall of Fame back in the early 2000s, and that preceded the 2006 special election of Negro Leaguers into the Hall of Fame. I did some work for Dick and Larry. I did the 1928-1934 seasons. And I continued with my statistical work after that. I started my blog, Agate Type, I'm sorry, I think I don't know if you hear my dog is, I have a dog who tends to object to Zoom proceedings. So, and I started posting my research to my blog, including stats. And eventually, Kevin and Mike, whom I knew online already at that point for several years, approached me and said, well, instead of posting your data to your blog in the form of just spreadsheets, maybe it would make more sense to have it, presented systematically so that people can read it more easily on Seamheads. And so that's where the Seamheads database got started. Excuse me. And that was around 2011. Shortly after that, I reached out to Larry Lester and Dick Clark because I knew that after the Hall of Fame study, they had continued to refine the statistics that they had been working on there. And I knew that we could use their work to fill in the seasons that that we hadn't gotten to yet. And so since that actually happened, I was checking the chronology of this out last night, and that happened quicker than I thought. We actually started doing that in around 2012. So it's been a work of collaboration for quite a while now. And so we've been doing that. And as of, I think, January 2020, we had actually gotten to cover every season of the sort of traditional Negro major leagues from 1920 through 1948, which, perhaps not coincidentally, that's exactly the period that that MLB has decided to recognize. And that announcement came in December of 2020. So within the same year that we actually achieved full coverage. So so it's been, and I should also point out that it's not just myself, Kevin, Mike, Larry, and the late Dick Clark, but also Scott Simkus has been an important contributor. He's somebody who I've worked with and known for a long time. He's done a couple of seasons for us and various games for other seasons. Patrick Rock is another important contributor. He's done 1923 and 1942. So, and there are plenty of other people who've contributed lots of information, biographical information on players and box scores that we couldn't get ourselves, and so on. So that's how we got to this point with the Seamheads database. I thought I would go back and talk about the Negro Leagues in general, just to give you an idea of the challenges involved in compiling statistics for them. There are sort of two underlying conditions of the Negro Leagues that are very important to keep in mind. I mean, one is obviously segregation, the color line in baseball, which of course goes back to the 1880s, and really the roots of it go back farther than that, almost to the beginning of the game in the 1860s. And the other one is that prior to maybe 1950 or so, there was a whole economy of baseball that's more or less doesn't exist anymore, which is to say that there was an appetite for baseball beyond the major leagues and even beyond the minor leagues. So across the country, there were hundreds, even thousands of independent professional baseball teams playing. Even in large cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia, if you didn't want to or couldn't afford to buy a ticket to a Yankees or a Giants or a Cubs game, you could go buy a ticket to an independent semi-professional team that played sometimes in the same stadium, sometimes in their own stadiums in New York in Dyckman Oval or Dexter Park in Queens. And this sort of appetite for baseball that went beyond the majors and even the minors meant that Black baseball, whose main fan base was, of course, in Black communities, also had another source of income, which is to say white fans who also who had a disposable income and desire for entertainment beyond what they could get. So so there was actually a market niche that was outside of organized baseball. That consisted largely of a Black fan community, but also included other places, not just large cities, but also small towns where league baseball didn't reach. So your typical Negro League team, even in the era of the leagues in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, a large part of their income actually came from either barnstorming through small towns or playing strong white semi-pro teams in bigger cities, or playing all-star games against white major and minor league teams. So a Negro League season might consist of, say, 50% league games and 50% of all these other kinds of games that they also use to keep their teams afloat and make their payrolls. So what this results in is a kind of complicated situation for historians, as you can imagine, because Negro League teams played a lot of games in their own home parks, but they also spent a lot of time traveling, a lot of time barnstorming. That means that a lot of games were played not as official league games, but as exhibition games or as games against interleague games against other leagues, or against white major league teams and so on. This is sort of combined with the fact that there was no real centralized source of information on for Negro League statistics, reports of games, coverage, and so on. The most important source, of course, for historians and for folks at the time were the Black weekly newspapers. And prior to the 1930s, pretty much all African-American newspapers were weeklies. They were not daily papers. The Atlanta Daily World in 1933 became the first important Black newspaper to actually go daily. But even after that, for a couple of decades, major papers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier, the Afro-American in Baltimore, Philadelphia Tribune, Kansas City Call, they were all weekly papers. Many of them were actually distributed nationally. So you might live in a small town in the South, you might subscribe to the Kansas City Call or to the Chicago Defender, and it would get sent to you every week. You'd get it, a few days, maybe a week after it was published. So these papers did have a national reach, and they had a national ambition to cover news that was important to the Black community, and that included sports. However, you're talking about papers that often were 16 pages, 24 pages for the entire issue, and you might have 2 or 3 pages per week devoted to sports. Now, in those days, prior to 1950, baseball was the king of sports, more or less. So a lot of it was baseball. So you actually got they packed a lot of material in there. Their ambition was to cover, as much as they could of the Negro Leagues. They couldn't get to everything. So you find dozens of box scores per week, but you're not going to find box scores and coverage of every game. So it is necessary to supplement the Black weekly newspapers with the daily papers in the cities where the games were played. It sometimes comes as a surprise to people that the mainstream papers or white papers also covered Black baseball. But in fact, they did. In fact, the farther back you go before 1950, if you get before 1930 or 1920, that was part of the way that they filled the newspapers with box scores for baseball games. It was like they'd put in almost anything, including down to grammar school games in some instances. So there's actually a lot of material in terms of like coverage of games that you can find in the daily papers. They didn't tend to have a lot of commentary. It was just the box score and nothing else. But it is a necessary source that you then add that to what you can find in the weekly papers. Now, the other issue with with the coverage in the Black weekly papers is that because of lack of space, they didn't tend to publish. They published statistics sometimes. It tended to be very partial and not and incomplete and occasional. So. For the most part, in the 20s and 30s, with a couple of exceptions, we don't have like season end complete statistics published at the time. In the 1940s, we have a more consistent attempt to do this, but prior to that, there isn't that much. So historians today are left needing to piece this record together, game by game, day by day, week by week. So we have to go into the newspapers and find, find as much as we can. And that's the biggest reason why, it's taken us, decades to put together the record that we have now, and the reason that it's also the reason that it's not finished and it's still a work in progress to this day. So it's also the reason why when you look at Negro League statistics, they don't quite look the same way that Major League statistics do. The number of games is smaller because league games were a smaller portion of a team's season than they were for the majors. And it's also true that the length of league seasons varied, sometimes dramatically from year to year. Essentially, like in the Negro Leagues, the club, the team was sort of the main unit of organization. We tend to think of it as like, today as like you have a sports league and the league hands out franchises. Well, to some degree that was the case. But in many cases, the team was really the primary unit. The Kansas City Monarchs left, the Negro National League after the 1930 season when they purchased a portable lighting system and realized that the owner, J.L. Wilkinson, realized that he could probably make more money barnstorming constantly with this novel new thing in night baseball through smaller towns and cities in the Midwest and West. He decided he could make more money doing that than sticking to a strict league schedule. And so he actually left the organized Negro Leagues for 6 years until the Negro American League was founded in 1937. And this was something, the Homestead Grays were also an independent team through much of that time. So it's one of the ways in which, the history of the Negro Leagues is a little bit different and has its own character. And that's what creates challenges for those of us who want to reconstruct records of Negro League games and leagues and teams. So so I wanted to so I wanted to get to that. Then I wanted to get to the recent recognition of maybe first I should talk about the our database, maybe how, like if you've never looked at it, like how you might interpret some of the material we have there. So there are a couple of principles that we adhere to in compiling it. The first is that it's a record of performance. It's not an attempt to decide what's official and what's not. Because so much baseball was played outside of the purview of the leagues, and it was serious baseball, like serious games. So, and we think they're very important for understanding the careers of these players. So my emphasis has always been on recording performance. We certainly have league standings and we record the results of postseason games and all-star games and so on. But the point is recording performance, not necessarily determining official statistics, which of course raises some interesting questions with respect to MLB recognition, as you can imagine. And other principles include, like I always record both sides of every game. So that means that when we have exhibition games between white major leaguers and black major leaguers, you've also got the results on the white side. So that's the reason you can look up Babe Ruth and see how he did, against Negro League opposition on our website. You can look up Ty Cobb, and see how he did in Cuba against Cuban teams that included Black American players. So sometimes people get a little confused that they can look up white players on the Negro League database, but that's the reason why. I think it's important that you have both sides of everything so that you can properly assess the context and understand, what was actually going on at the time. The other another thing to think about too, with respect to the database, is that you see here. Well, the other thing I think that we've kind of already covered that, but it is very much a work in progress. So that means, we have reached complete coverage of the 1920 through 1948 seasons, but there's always more to add. Like Mike was saying, there's always, like, maybe somebody will, uncover some box of lost scorebooks, in their attic, or, maybe some heretofore missing newspaper gets archived, and we can find a bunch of box scores from a city that we didn't have much coverage of before. So it's definitely a work in progress, and if something is not on there, most likely we will get to it at some point. So when we were still constructing the database, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, occasionally somebody would contact me and ask why we didn't have 1926 on there, and were we claiming that, the 1926 Negro National League was not a major league or something, and I always have to explain to, like, no, we just haven't gotten to it yet, but we'll get to it. So with respect to MLB recognition, I would say there are a couple of things we should probably remember about that, or realize about it. One is that it doesn't change anything about the history of what happened. So it's not an attempt, I think, to erase or change history, or claim or try to pretend in some way that the color line or segregation, or the racist discrimination that was suffered by the black ball players, that it all didn't matter, or we can all forget about it now. In fact, it's quite the opposite in my view. I think that, if anything, it calls attention to all of that. And I think if you put the records, the records of black baseball and the records of the white major leagues together, it just calls attention to the to the sort of violence that was done to these players. And I think that another thing to think of is that I had a reporter ask me, how does it feel to have made all these men major leaguers? And of course, my response was, well, they made themselves major leaguers. It was not something that can be conferred on them by MLB as, like, the arbiters of quality or respectability. It's something that was very much an achievement of the Negro Leaguers themselves, the players, the teams, the fans who watch them. Sorry, my dog is here. That's something that I think should be kept in mind with respect to MLB recognition. I think it's a really good thing that they've done, and I think of it as recognition of the truly equal status that the black baseball leagues and teams and players earned for themselves, and it's MLB is getting around to recognizing that now. I think, trying to think if I had anything else in particular I wanted to say. I mean, I can answer any questions that anybody's got.
Gary, there's a question in the chat box about the data. How granular is the Negro Leagues data? Will we see box scores for most league games posted on Seamheads in the future?
Yes, we will in the future. Yeah, that's actually one aspect of our database that we're working on. In the past, we've always focused on season level stats, just essentially because that's where I started. Obviously, underlying it are game level statistics. It's just something that we haven't put into a consistent format yet. But yes, that's something that we'll get to.
Open mic questions for Mike or Gary? Oh. I'm a little bit surprised. There's just so much interest and complexity in this topic. And I think when you two and I had our conversation earlier, or what, late was it December when we first connected, thanks to Bill Nolan, who's on today, and thank you, Bill. I remember you used the word more than once in our get to know each other. We are going to talk agnostically about the information, let others draw the conclusions, and certainly there are going to be a lot of conclusions that are going to be drawn. But where do you all go in the near term going forward? Anything are you looking for volunteers, for people can help you, like RetroSheet? The RetroSheet reach out, if I could call it that. Is that a fair analogy to make?
Sure, it's a fair analogy. Sure, we're always interested in folks who would like to help out, in particular collecting box scores that we haven't gotten to yet. So that's always something we're looking for.
We also get emails from people that do volunteer to help. So I always pass those on to Gary and Kevin and let them make the decision. But I think it's also important to note the time frame, 1920 to 1948. That was MLB's decision.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, we do have a question, a couple here popped up. How do you extract, whoops, my gosh, this really coming. Gotta scroll up here for a minute, pardon me. How do you extract things like batters, walks, and defensive stats from newspaper box scores? Excellent question, number one.
Well, actually, probably most box scores in that era had fielding statistics, first of all. The quality of box scores is probably better than you would expect, at least based on the discussions I usually hear around the Negro Leagues. There's a lot of talk about at-bats being missing and so on. That's true for some, but that's very much a minority of the box scores in the 20s, 30s, and 40s era. Prior to 1920, it's more common, but still not the case in every game. Walks, you can, if you have at-bats and a decent summary section with sacrifice hits, and the total number of walks in the game, that's actually something you can figure out for each batter. So it's not that hard to do. It's harder, and obviously you can't do it nearly as easily in games without at-bats. So it's more an issue there of distributing them equally among all the batters, or using the game game account that accompanies the box score, to fill in details like that. So, but it's actually the state of the records for each game is probably better than a lot of people would think. I mean, there are a lot of newspapers that published really high quality box scores for Negro League games in that era.
So you truly are a baseball box score forensic analyst.
Yes.
First order. Okay, second question. This brings memories back when we got to know each other back in December. Were there any players that jumped out at you when doing your research that you weren't aware of? I think you've probably got a long list there, but could you give us one?
Yeah, there are tons of those. There are tons of those. I've, one thing I didn't mention is that, of course, we've done a lot of, I've compiled statistics for about 20 years of the Cuban League. And that was important because many Black American ball players went to Cuba to play pro baseball in the winters, like during, I mean, as far back as the year 1900. And so it's a huge source for, very, very precise information about how Black American players, in addition to Cuban ball players, performed in that era. There was a player named Carlos Moran, who was a left-handed third baseman in the Cuban League in the 1900s, 1910s. One of the last left-handed third basemen in that league or anywhere professionally. And he walked a ton. And it's one of those things that it wasn't included in the official statistics in the Cuban League, but their box scores were of high quality, and it's very easy to extract walks from them. So he walked a lot, and he's a lot like a player named Roy Thomas, center fielder in the U.S. Major Leagues. Sort of a not a power hitter, but he walked a ton and had had an amazing on base percentage. I would say in terms of North American, Black players like Negro Leaguers. Pete Hill's another one whose I think statistics were a bit surprising, and largely also because of the on-base percentage, because of the number of walks he got. Another instance would be the case of Negro League third baseman. So I think traditionally, you think of Judy Johnson, Oliver Marcel, Ray Dandridge. Johnson and Dandridge are in the Hall of Fame. Those are sort of traditionally considered the great Negro League third baseman. They're sort of an old style third baseman, like glove first, like very much they were great fielding players. As hitters, they were more like how we would consider, middle infielders now. They're pretty good hitters, but not power hitters. When you actually go back to the statistics, it turns out that you've got several Negro League third basemen who are great power hitters. Judd Wilson was one, John Beckwith, a guy named Bus Clarkson in the 1940s. And so statistical analysis kind of suggests that those guys maybe were more valuable than the more traditionally considered great third baseman of Negro League history. So.
Another question quickly, were you surprised or disappointed by the amount of data available to you on the Negro Leagues?
I'm always surprised. Like there's always more than I think. Actually, it's rare that I'm disappointed or I think that I'm going to find something and I don't. I'm always amazed at just how much more there is than I thought. When I started, the 1920s are very well represented, which I think a lot of people might surprise them. It's actually the farther back you go in the history of the Negro Leagues, the better the statistical record is. For a number of reasons, newspapers printed more box scores earlier, and they started not printing as many in the 30s, and especially in the 40s. So if you're reconstructing statistics through box scores, 1920s is really kind of the golden age. But as I was doing the 1920s, I sort of had this vague idea that looking forward into the 40s, I thought, no, there's not going to be much there. Some of the published statistics for the 1940s that I had seen, might show like a handful of games per player. So when I actually got to the 1940s, I was very pleasantly surprised. There's a lot more material there than I had realized. Some newspapers like the Washington Post, Baltimore Sun, some years, for as far as daily newspapers go, we're pretty good about Negro League box scores. Some Black weeklies that are not always thought of as the most important, like the Defender and Courier, like the New York Amsterdam News, had a lot of good material in it in the 1940s, like more than I expected. So yeah, I'm always surprised at how much more stuff I find than I expect. So.
At the opposite end of the spectrum is the Sporting News, which didn't cover the Negro Leagues at all.
Yeah.
All right. We have one, I'm just trying to do this quickly, and then we need to transition to our closer here. About the number of quote unquote major leaguers that are being added to the rolls as a result of the MLB decision. And the person who put the question in the chat box said that we were counting down to the 20,000th major leaguer that might be on the dockets for this season. However, now with this, that's reset the game clock, so to speak. Do you have any idea about how many new major leaguers have been added to the capture of numbers since the MLB decision?
That's well, that's an interesting point, because given the way the research always progresses, I think some of those things where you have like, I guess, the 20,000th player or the whatever, the 1 millionth run or whatever, that kind of stuff might kind of go up and down a little bit for a little while now, depending on what we find. But the number of players that, okay, so if the MLB's is officially recognizing the 7 leagues from 1920 to 1948. And if you only count players who appear on those games and on games between those teams, it's about 2,400. So a little more than that. I think it might be like 2,417, something like that. It changes. Literally, we just did an update and I was able to add several players. We did an update like last night, and so I have a few more and I was able to uncover. If you count the independent teams that we count as major league during that era, the number will jump up to about 2,700 new players. It's my feeling that ultimately MLB probably will count those teams, because it includes teams like the 1931 Homestead Grays that had 6 Hall of Famers. So it's, the first 2 years of Josh Gibson's career was spent with an independent team, the Homestead Grays. And I have a feeling that eventually they're going to be considered major league as well. So that would be 2,700 new players. In our whole database, going back to the 1880s, Black professional players in the U.S., like what we consider Negro leaguers, there's about 3,400. So,
okay, well, thank you. In the interest of time, we've got to bring this to a close. But Mike and Gary, thank you so much for coming and spending some time with us on this incredibly important and somewhat complicated topic. So, thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you.
So, like any good baseball game or baseball meeting, we need to have a closer. And it's time to make the wave to the bullpen and ask our chair of the board of directors, Mark Armour, to come into the game and give us an update on what this SABR task force is all about, which he's chairing, and the impact and the positive impact for sure will have on this topic. And Mark, as a lifelong Yankees fan, I'm going to ask you to do your best impersonation of Mariano Rivera. And I know you're up to it to close us out today. So over to you. You're on mute, Mark.
I might end up being more like Koji Uehara. I knew Mike would appreciate that anyway. So the SABR task force got together in the fall, and we kind of ran a little bit parallel to Major League Baseball. And a lot of the people, most of the people we got together were some of the Negro League historians, as well as, Gary and some of his cohorts, and some of the research chairs. And I just want to stress that it should be obvious, but, we're not Major League Baseball. We had sort of a different set of issues that we had to tackle with. Major League Baseball is a $10 billion a year corporation, and obviously some of the pushback they got were, well, are you going to fund some of this research? What are you going to do for the families? And that's all like their thing. We're not really involved in any of that. We're just baseball enthusiasts and record keepers and historians. And for the most part, my interest in the task force and my role in the task force was to listen to the consensus of the people that have been working on this for many, many years and decades, and including Larry, who is, you know, one of my idols in this in SABR, and Gary, of course. And so we, you know, ended up recognizing the same leagues that that Major League Baseball has, because that's the current consensus of historians. But we are also going to be, I'm certainly an advocate for some of the expansion that some of the members of the task force have talked about, maybe pushing out the Negro American League a couple years, or adding independent teams, or doing some pre-1920 material. The pushback that we've gotten inside of SABR has been very friendly and not contentious. I haven't run into a lot of anti-Negro League sentiment. The sentiment that would be maybe anti-chaos, that there are some genuine sort of fear and discomfort from some people that we have this record book that is, you know, 99.9% accurate, and is, people have been working on this for years and years and years, and suddenly we're throwing a big pile of new records on the pile and saying, and there are some years where we have, you know, 60% of the box scores, and that is new and challenging and a little bit scary for some people. And I understand that, and I think everybody on the task force appreciates that and understands that. However, at the end of the day, I think that's kind of our job in SABR, is to help reduce the chaos and push the data forward, push the truth forward as much as we can. If we're 60% of the way done with box scores for 1943 in the Negro National League, then let's try and make it 65% or 68% or 69%. And let's just keep going. And I think that's kind of what we're good at. SABR was founded in 1971, and I don't think it's a coincidence that it was right after the publication of the Big Mac, because I think that the work that ICI did, many of the people who worked on that ended up being founders of SABR. And I think it's no coincidence that it made baseball history sort of real to a lot of people in a way that they could wrap their hands around. Like, here are the people, here are the teams, here is what we now know. And it made it a little bit, it was a sort of a friendly environment for people that wanted to say, let's get a little bit more, let's get a little bit more, let's get a little bit more, which is what SABR was doing in many of those years. And I don't believe that SABR is recognizing the quality of the Negro Leagues, because I think that was already obvious. I think that much like what Gary said, I think that the case for the quality of the Negro Leagues was made in the 1920s and 1930s, and it became obvious to white America in the 1950s and 1960s how great these players obviously were. But what I hope we're doing is putting a stake in the ground and saying that these leagues are just as important, just as big a part of the fabric of baseball history as all the other leagues we've studied for so long. And, you know, many SABR members have been studying the Negro Leagues for a long time, many years. It was one of the earliest committees that we had. And a lot of the great work that's been done to the history has obviously been done by people in SABR and the Negro Leagues Committee and the Malloy Conference. And if I have a hope, it's that is even more put sort of inside the tent as part of, you know, the great history of the game. And, you know, it might attract some new people who have heretofore thought of it as a side project for SABR, and now it's maybe it's more centered. But I personally, I just want to say I tip my hat to the great work that people have done. I think as an historian myself, I owe a debt of gratitude to the work that ICI did in the 60s. And I think I owe a similar debt to the work that Larry and Gary and Kevin and Mike have done in the last decade or more for very similar reasons. They've, brought this history to life. They didn't create the history actually happened, but I think that they've helped us shine a light on it. And what SABR is saying more formally, and I hope that we were always saying this, but certainly more formally now, is thank you. You're in the center of the organization, and the history that you're helping us recognize is actually, to me, very exciting, because it's the 65% of the box scores is actually more fun to tackle than the 99.9% is. There's actually work to do. So that's what we're good at. So I'll be glad to take questions, but mostly I just want to tip my hat to all the people that did all this work.
Any questions for Mark?
I have a question. Where's my Chadwick Award?
It's in the mail.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I have no answer to that. You caught me off guard. I'm not the king of the Chadwick Award, but
Well, any last shot for a question for Mark before we close today? Well, Mark, I want to thank you. You did Mariano proud. You displayed a sharp cutter today. And those were really seriously some very great comments. I would hope our chapter could leave the door open for you to come back in future meetings and give us updates on what the task force is up to, because clearly this is a journey, not a sprint in going forward with regard to the Negro Leagues, how the records are integrated and all the dimensions that go forward. I think there's a fascinating story unfolding here, and we hope you would come back and share with us again where the task force goes in the future.
anytime. I like Cleveland very much. My wife is from Cleveland, born and raised, so I spent a lot of time there. Not in the past year, obviously, but who knows? Maybe I'll see you guys in person sometime.
We would love that when we're ready to open our doors again for our chapter meeting. So we ran a little bit over today, our 2 hours, but I think it was well worth running over. I hope you share my feeling that we had a great meeting, great presentations, some great questions and interactions, and we hope you all enjoyed it. I will be reaching out to you for the infamous post-meeting survey, so you can take your best shots and make your best recommendations. Our chapter is working on our next meeting or meetings for spring. Don't have anything to say other than their work's in progress, and you'll hear from us soon. And with that, we'll close off what we hope you felt was a very worthwhile expenditure of 2 hours on, at least in Cleveland, a cold winter afternoon. So thank you all so much. Be safe, be healthy, and we will reconnect soon.
Good seeing you again, Mark.
Thank you, Joe.
See you, Mike.
Thanks, Joe. Good program.
I hope you all enjoyed it.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.